Pedro joined the Brazilian section of the Theosophical Society in 1976 and has worked in several capacities. He served as the International Secretary in ADJAR between 1992 and 1996. Pedro has also served as the Education Coordinator in Theosophical Society in Australia and was also the President of the Indo-Pacific Federation and has lectured extensively in Australia, the Indo-Pacific region and other countries as well, which includes giving many presentations in ADJAR, which I've had the good fortune of listening to, and he is very inspiring. Pedro is the author of 3 books: In Sri Ram, A Life of Beneficence and Wisdom, CWL Speaks, and these are concerning CWL Leadbeater's correspondence in the 1906 crisis in the Theosophical Society and Annie Besant in India. His articles have been published in many international journals. So we're really grateful and happy, Pedro, that you can launch the series for us on time-tested teachings and texts. As I said at the start, Pedro also launched our Zoom series on 15th of February for ADJAR Day and gave us an inspiring talk on that occasion. So Pedro's session tonight, the topic is The Voice of the Silence by H.P. Blavatsky. Pedro, over to you. Welcome. Great to have you here. Thanks.
Thank you, Simon, and good evening, everyone. It is 5:08 in Sydney, but across the Tasman it should be 7:08. And that means Simon was a very effective introducer because his time frame was quite right. Since I am the first speaker in the series, I would like to wish the series well, and as well as the members who attended and participate. Some of you who know a little bit of the history of the Theosophical Society, and this has been the subject, my subject of research for several years now, will know that although what is called the magnum opus of Theosophical literature, the Secret Doctrine, was published by Madame Blavatsky in 1888, she chose as her last book The Voice of the Silence. Now, if it has been said unofficially that you shouldn't give a copy of the Secret Doctrine to a newcomer in the Theosophical Society, because that would be an act of cruelty. The book is very dense, it's profoundly metaphysical, and it requires preliminary readings and so on. But with The Voice of the Silence is different. Obviously, with the Secret Doctrine, Madame Blavatsky wanted to enlarge the mindset of the Western world and to think of the ancient traditions, and to see how the teachings of the ancient traditions could throw light into our modern culture and predicament. And if you peruse the Secret Doctrine, and even if you open it at random, you will see that in one paragraph, she normally mentions 4 or 5 different traditions to exemplify her thesis that Theosophy is the ancient wisdom religion. Not a formal religion in any sense, but as she said, religion as that which binds all human beings and all beings into one grand whole, which is the universe. That was her theosophical view of religion. But if in the Secret Doctrine there was this emphasis to enlarge the perceptions of people and the students, for them to start appreciating the ancient traditions and the depth of their teaching, and therefore provoking the human mind to become, to leave their accustomed grooves, so to speak. In The Voice of the Silence, there is a different call. And the different call is mentioned by her several times during the preface. And basically, she says that the Voice of the Silence is a book for mystics. And at the end of the preface, she says, it was written for the few mystics within the Theosophical Society. I upset someone many years ago, not intentionally, when I quoted in one presentation a Theosophical glossary written on the humorous side. For example, in this glossary, the word Kamaloka, which is a technical term for the astral plane or the region after the physical life, the word Kamaloka was defined as a place to keep camels. And the word mystic was defined as mystic, as an ineffectual glue. And this person who considered himself a mystic was very upset with me, and I tried to explain that it was just a humorous mention, but anyhow, over the decades in which I have been associated with the TS, in an unwritten way, in a very subtle way, some people suggest that occultism is on a higher scale than mysticism, right? If I had the opportunity, without upsetting them, I said, have you read the preface of The Voice of the Silence? Madame Blavatsky, she didn't agree with that view. And she even quotes a very important text in the Indian tradition, apparently originated in Maharashtra, the Jnaneshwari, which is like a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. And then she said that in that book, there is a description of a yogi in a state of self-realization, which we cannot understand. And that brings me to the meaning of the word mystic. It has been said by different people and by different dictionaries and encyclopedias that there is a link between the words mysticism, mystic, mythology, and mysteries. And the link is that the word mystic derives from a Greek verb, muon, which now is also a subatomic particle. And the meaning of this verb is to close the eyes and the lips. In other words, a mystical experience shuts down the chattering mind, the talkative mind, and reveals to the mystic this other dimension in which there is no separation, in which there is no surviving me with its own interests and likes and dislikes. And this, I have made a more in-depth study about this. We don't have time to comment on this, but there is a link between all the mystics. They really emphasize this, that the experience is so profound that it changed them. Take for example, St. Thomas Aquinas, who is still a towering figure in the Western theology, right? He is still considered one of the greatest theologians of all time. He wrote a number of books, including very large books. They are called Summa Theologica, a theological summing up. And they are very thick and large. If you have to borrow them from a library, you need a wheelbarrow. And so his greatest feat was to justify the Christian teaching in the Gospels through the Aristotelian logic. He studied the logic of Aristotle in detail and in depth. And he managed to do that. So he was a scholar. He was very respected. He was also a teacher. But history says that towards the end of his life, he had a mystical experience. And he had a friend who became then his biographer. And after that experience, he went into a monastery. He never wrote anymore. He never spoke until he died a few years later. But before he reached the monastery, he mentioned to his friends this: everything that I have written can be compared to straw in the light of what I have seen. So you can understand that what he experienced was beyond the mind. It shut down the most powerful intellect of his age. That's the power of mysticism. And it is understandable from a theosophical point of view, because in the Mahatma letters, when the Mahatmas speak about Buddhi, they say the supreme energy resides in Buddhi alone, in this intuitional wisdom that is unlimited. And if the mind is wise enough to be quiet for some time, it may contact some aspect of this experience. So, The Voice of the Silence is a book on mysticism written for mystics in the Theosophical Society. Nowadays, it has become a global classic. And I really, for those of you who can, I really suggest that you read the preface, because it's very enlightening. And also, Madame Blavatsky said, if I may quote from the preface here, she said that the book, The Voice of the Silence, comes from the book of the Golden Precepts. It's a very ancient book. It's not available on Google Books, by the way. Mm-hmm. And she says some of which are pre-Buddhistic, while others belong to a later date. It contains, the book of the Golden Precepts, 90 distinct little treatises. Of this, I learned 39 by heart years ago. This is part of her training in Tibet. Very little is known about her training, but obviously she was given some text to study in depth, and she learned 39 treatises by heart. And then she said she had learned much more than 39. She had studied more, but she didn't want to publish them because, she said, nor could they be all translated and given to a world too selfish and too much attached to objects of sense to be in any way prepared to receive such exalted ethics in the right spirit. And here comes the clinching phrase, for unless a man or a woman perseveres seriously in the pursuit of self-knowledge, they will never lend a willing ear to advice of this nature. And it's interesting that at the beginning of The Voice of the Silence, if you can get hold of a copy, you will see in the dedication page, dedication to the few. Of course, I was a young theosophist in Brazil many decades ago, and when I first read that book and came back to the dedication page, I said, Madame Blavatsky could have spelled the word few instead of F-E-W as P-H-E-W, because it's quite an effort to understand and put in practice all this. But it's interesting to note that there are even more exalted ethical teachings that they have not been shared with the world from the world of the Mahatmas, because there is no point in making them available if people would say, for example, oh no, I'm not going to study this. I'd rather spend my evenings watching Netflix. So I have nothing against Netflix. I'm just giving you an example. All right. Now, I have selected a few verses of the book, The Voice of the Silences, to comment with you. I think I believe from what Simon says, we will have time for interaction after some time. One of these verses is the very first verse of the book. These instructions are not these instructions are for those ignorant of the dangers of the lower id. That's the very first verse of the book. The word id, she says, is a Pali word, and it is synonym with the Sanskrit word siddhis, the supernormal powers that reside within the human consciousness. But she said that there are two kinds of siddhis. One group which embraces the lower, coarse, psychic and mental energies, and the other one which exacts the highest training of spiritual powers. So this has been a very clear message within the Theosophical Society, not that people should accept, but the message is there in the literature, that there is a very profound difference between spirituality and psychism. And it's not just the Theosophical Society that says that. Many teachers from the past and even the present say that. Even St. Paul, for example, say that there are different dimensions in us. There is a psychic dimension, but the psychic dimension, he says, is not the numinous dimension where the spiritual reality is. And the psychic dimension, because it is located within the personal mind, it can be very misleading. Why? Because the mind, as Madame Blavatsky suggested, our minds, they are kama manas, they are the desire mind. So everything the mind looks at, it doesn't look at from an objective point of view, it looks at from a personal point of view, and therefore it generates likes and dislikes. I don't need to explain why the human mind operates like that, because we all know, and unless I stop a little bit and ask the question, is there anybody in this group of students who has never experienced likes and dislikes? You have 8 seconds. I'm still waiting. So that is the nature of the human mind. And she said that, that if this mind would acquire powers, what do you think would happen? The personal element in us would appropriate those powers for our own interest. And that's why, for example, in many countries, the weekend newspaper contains ads from different clairvoyants who offer guidance if you are willing to pay them, right? So that gift doesn't come for free. That's only one aspect. The most serious aspect is that if you go after psychic powers without a thorough understanding of yourself, those psychic powers, if activated, they will magnify everything within you, both the good and the not good. And therefore, the Theosophical literature suggests that one should not go after psychic powers, not because they don't exist, but that because one has to be prepared to develop them. And in the case of very advanced students like Madame Blavatsky, she never whispered a word about her spiritual development. It's not available in the literature. Are you bored? No. Now, 2 other verses which are very famous, very well known, and very deep. We have a little time to consider them. Some people sometimes misunderstand them. The mind is the great slayer of the real. Let the disciple slay the slayer. I was attending the Crotone School of Theosophy in California, in Ojai, California, and Joy Mills was our teacher. She said, too many people, they repeat these verses out of their own convenience and without understanding that. And then she said, therefore, I'm going to give you a Joy Mills verse. We were not meant to be mindless. In the Secret Doctrine, there is a very interesting teaching that there are 10 hierarchies in existence, both below the human level and above the human level. But the hierarchy of the human level is an important one. And the key to its development is how to reach the proper functioning of the mind, and how the mind can relate itself properly with the principles that are below it, like desire, for example, and the principles that are above it, like spiritual intuition. So, the mind is the great slayer of the real. So when I read this, the first question that came to my mind is, if the real is real, how can the real be slain? Of course, the real cannot be slain because the real exists in the dimension of eternity, timelessness. But the constant chatter of the mind shuts itself from that dimension. And therefore, for that mind, the real doesn't exist. And therefore, the teaching said, let the disciple slay the slayer. Slay the slayer is a poetic expression which is similar to what is done in the Zen Buddhist tradition. So that the disciple or student learn through the use of koans that all thought is limited, that thought is not reality. Thought is just an expression of the activity of the mind. So this is another verse that is in the very beginning of the book, which is very important. And the Theosophical literature, therefore, and even Madame Blavatsky and others suggest that when we read, we shouldn't try to read too much, because this is another characteristic of the personal mind. It wants to read too much. The suggestion is we should read little or less, and then whenever we find something of profound importance, we should stop reading and give attention to that, to see what it means. Because in that very attention, the mind can reach a deeper perception. For example, in the Indian tradition, particularly in the Vedanta school, in one of the Upanishads, the question was asked, how can the self, that means the Atman, the pure spirit, the pure consciousness, how can the Atman be known? And the answer in the Upanishads was Shravana Manana Nididhyasan, listening, reflecting, meditating. This is how the mind gets transformed. The first stage is to listen. So, as I was saying, if we find something in our study that is of importance, we should stop the study and give attention to that. Listen to what that passage is saying. In one of the letters from the masters, they quote Shakespeare in saying that there can be sermons in stones and books in brooks. I had difficulty in the beginning because my knowledge of English is much worse than it is now. And my English now is very limited. Perhaps we should continue in the Kannada language. When you pay attention, there is a whole world to be discovered. Of course, the current culture doesn't help, you know. If you have 10 stream channels, lots of downloaded music, TV programs, the mind says, what? Should I stop my activities? No way, I want to remain here. Of course, that is its choice. But for those who are really interested, this is the suggestion. The next verse is a more daunting one, more demanding one, but it's equally important. It is in the first fragment, verse 56. The self of matter and the self of spirit can never meet. One of the twain must disappear. There is no place for both. Some people have interpreted this in a negative way, saying that this is almost like a cynical statement. Why should the self, the personal self, disappear? Without the personal self, we cannot encounter experiences, we cannot have a bank account, and we cannot even put our name on a dating site. This is what they say, you know. But when you look at it, the self of matter is the product of material evolution, both physical, emotional, and mental. There is matter there. And why? Because it has become a very strong center that protects itself from experience, you know. Many years ago, our former international president, Radhaji, made this comment about Othello of Shakespeare. You know the story of Othello. He was attacked by little green monsters of jealousy, right? And he was convinced that his wife had betrayed him. And Iago, another character of the play, was reaffirming that conviction that, yes, she has betrayed you. And he became increasingly hostile, aggressive, and he used to have outbursts and shout and yell at people. And Radhaji said, when we look at the character of Othello, truly, if we really look what he's saying with all that aggressive behavior and yell and so on, he is saying, I am lost. I need help. And this is what some modern educators and psychologists are saying in relation to bullying. You know? Of course, we need to deal with the subject of bullying, and nobody can get away with it. But in order to understand it, we have to understand that there is like a protective shell there. And it's all, and this shell is based on this sense of self, which is the product of our experiences, you know. And in every tradition, they say that the more someone progresses on the spiritual path, the more he or she realizes that a number of things should be left behind, should be let go of, you know. I suggest, and I have suggested this in the past, that we need to ask this question: why many people, perhaps even ourselves, harbor some form of resentment? An American theosophist, Dora Kunz, was a former president of the Theosophical Society in the United States, and a very equipped and brilliant clairvoyant. She said in an essay with another psychologist called Shafika Karagula, that resentment is a very strong undercurrent, and it will eventually affect our health, and also affecting others as well. So, and who gets resented? The self, you know. We can't dictate or modify people according to what we should expect from them, but we can face their actions with a different spirit. Mr. Sri Ram, I was fortunate enough to write a small biography of him with the full cooperation of Radhaji. He was harassed by this man in the office of New India. You know, Dr. Besant bought that paper and it became the vehicle of her political activity for India. Sri Ram was an assistant editor, and this other volunteer, very well off, kept harassing him, and he would say to Sri Ram, if you are at the main gate of the TS at 8 a.m., I'll come with my car and driver and give you a lift to the office of New India, which is in Mount Road in this downtown Madras. Sri Ram agreed. This man could see Sri Ram coming towards the gate 200 meters from the gate. If in his watch it was 8 o'clock, he would push off and cause Sri Ram to walk for almost 1.5 hours. And when he would arrive in the office, this man would harass him and so on. And that continued for quite some time. Sri Ram, of course, wouldn't react. He concentrated on his work. Years later, Sri Ram became the president of the TS. And one of his secretaries said, do you remember that man who used to harass you in the office of New India? And Sri Ram said, I remember him. He said, we have just received notice that he's living alone. He's an elderly man. He's living alone. And I interpreted that as that probably the family found it difficult to live with him. And what was Sri Ram's reaction? He instructed his secretary. He dictated a letter to this man. Why don't you come to Adyar? There is a place for you here. And when he came to Adyar, he was a different person, you know. And Radhaji told us that this is a way of helping people out of their egocentricity, see, not reacting. I know that some people may not think it's practical, but for a person like Sri Ram, was very practical. And the self of spirit cannot meet the self of matter, because the essence of the self of matter is separateness, division, personality. The self of spirit is boundless unity. The other verse is fragment 1, verse number 58. Thou canst not travel on the path before thou hast become that path itself. Again, this is present in many traditions. The path, of course, is a metaphor. It doesn't mean going to Dharamsala, Lourdes, you know, Bodh Gaya, Adyar, or Japan, say on sacred sites in Japan. The path is a movement within. It is a movement from the unreal to the real in us. And we have to ask that question, what is truly real for us? You know? And according to the Eastern tradition, the real never changes. And the mind who is on the path learns that it can never attribute too much value to those things that change, you know, because their nature is to change. I like to illustrate this with the stories of Mullah Nasruddin. You know, he was a literary figure created by Sufi teachers to impart wisdom, right? And he was once in his house, in front of his house. A friend came to visit him, and he saw Nasruddin looking for something on the ground. And then the friend said, "What happened, Mullah?" He said, "I lost my keys. So I'll help you to look for them." So they searched for half an hour. They were under a light post, and suddenly the friend said, "Are you sure you lost them here?" Nasruddin said, "No, I lost them there, but there is more light here." You know, we are looking for happiness, realization, peace, love, where they are not. And because they exist in that clear area of our own consciousness, which has to be cultivated. And there is no difference between us and the path. This is what this verse says, you know. And it's not an easy thing to confront oneself. I am of the view, tentatively, that whoever is on the path has intensified, accelerated the process of self-confrontation. You know, you have to develop the courage to look at yourself and not fooling yourself that things will be better tomorrow and so on. Looking at yourself, for example, Madame Blavatsky said in one of her articles that the first requisite for self-knowledge is a complete conviction that we are constantly tricked. She doesn't word those words, but we are tricking ourselves, we are fooling ourselves. You know, that's what the mind does. In India, when this great Shankaracharya died, he was the Shankaracharya of Kanchipuram, and Chandrasekhara Saraswati Swamigal. He was a saint, basically. And the newspaper published several articles about him. I was immersed in that. That was in '94 and so on, when I met Sushma, and Simon was also there assisting a course of Dr. Ravi Ravindra, who is going to conduct another course in January there. And this Shankaracharya said with this extreme simplicity, but with a depth that you cannot find in many books, he said, self-knowledge is the longest journey to the nearest place. Self-knowledge is the longest journey to the nearest place. It is long because the mind gets lost. Sometimes it gets lost through several lives, you know. In a convention in Australia many, many years ago, one of our members who had been to US brought back what she called a karma credit card. This organization were selling karma credit cards, and if you buy this credit card, we will assure you that your karma will be downloaded in easy installments. There's no such thing, you know. Anyhow, continuing. There is another verse, fragment 1, number 65. Desire nothing, chafe not at karma, nor at nature's changeless laws, but struggle only with the personal, the transitory, the evanescent, and the perishable. I'll repeat this. Desire nothing, chafe not at karma, nor at nature's changeless laws, but struggle only with the personal, the transitory, the evanescent, and the perishable.
What verse is that, Pedro?
Hello?
What verse is that?
65, fragment 1.
Thanks.
And many people react at what happens to them, right? This shouldn't have happened to me, and this is too much, and so on. And but we cannot change this law of karma, you know. If something has happened, it has happened with the purpose. And nature has also its laws that we cannot change. It's very hard to see a natural catastrophe or calamity. Many people are affected, a number of them may die, And of course, the human duty is to help the survivors and so on, and to comfort those who have lost loved ones. But these things are part of life. What this verse is saying, that our job is to struggle with what is personal in us, because it's what is personal in us that creates many problems for us and for others. Mr. Jinarajadasa, C. Jinarajadasa, was a former president of the TS, an international lecturer, an author, a great person. He introduced in Theosophical literature the passion for art, for the beauty and so on. But he also suffered from diabetes. And in those days, the resources for dealing with diabetes were different. So there was one time in his life that diabetes put him in bed for several weeks. And it's very easy if you are sick that you feel despaired and you protest against that sickness. Do you know what he did? He decided to write an article called "The Privileges of Ill Health." And he said in this article, it was very moving. He said, "I am an active man. I travel, I write, I meet people, and so on." He was also interested in poetry. This illness has paralyzed all that. But this illness caused me to look at myself. So he used that time when he was sick in bed to look at himself. He didn't have an iPad, of course. He looked at himself, and that helped him. It's a different attitude towards what happened to us. Now, yes, there is a very important verse. This is fragment 2, verse 115. It's about the nature of the mind. It's a very helpful verse. For mind is like a mirror. It gathers dust while it reflects. It needs the gentle breezes of soul wisdom to brush away the dust of our illusions. Seek, O beginner, to blend thy mind and soul. This is about meditation, isn't it? I'll read it again. For mind is like a mirror. It gathers dust while it reflects. It needs the gentle breezes of soul wisdom to brush away the dust of our illusions. Seek, O beginner, to blend thy mind and soul. What the verse talks about dust, that in a way, every time that we perceive something, because there is conditioning in us, that condition throws dust at our perception. The perception is not pure. You meet a person, and you can test this for yourself. If you are talking to a friend or a person, and while that person is talking to you, you are already editing what you are going to say next. That means there is no listening. And Krishnamurti was having a dialogue with his friends in Varanasi in 1974. And one of them, Mrs. Pupul Jayakar, who was a staunch worker for the Krishnamurti work in India and the world, she wrote a beautiful biography of him. She said, "We have been listening to you for many decades. I want to ask the question, what is your teaching after all?" Krishna, you see, I have a theory here. If you ask a question to a wise person, you have to be prepared for self-demolition. Because a wise person doesn't function in your own sphere of the personal mind. They are on a different sphere. So she asked this question, after all, what is your teaching? And Krishnamurti very calmly said, there is no teacher and no disciple. She became agitated. She said, I can't accept that. And then he said to her, Pupulji, you are creating ripples. He said, if you throw a pebble into a pond, at the point of intersection, the energy of that impact generates concentric waves to the edge of the pond, and the waves come back to the center until that energy is dissipated. He said, but if you throw the pebble very close to the surface, the pebble enters the surface without creating ripples and goes to the very bottom. And he said, that is listening. So when you listen, you are not editing anything, you just listen attentively. And this is what the voice of the silence suggests. Mind is like a mirror, it gathers dust while it reflects. So instead of perceiving things afresh as they are, there is dust in our perception. I'm listening to the talk of a speaker. I go along up to a point and then he or she says something. I said, I can't accept that. Instead of listening. Because the point of view of a talk, at least in the TS, is not to accept anything. It's just to listen and to reflect and take away whatever you think it's worthwhile. There is this beautiful story. I translated a book on Zen stories before I came to Australia years ago. It's called Zen Bones, Zen Flesh by Paul Rep. The story says that there are two monks, Zen Buddhist monks in a monastery, and one monk is in his daily walk. It's a Zen walk, so it's very attentive, one foot after another. He saw a caterpillar on the floor, and he picked up the caterpillar and put the caterpillar in the cabbage garden. The other monk who was working in the cabbage garden said, brother, this caterpillar will reproduce here and it will destroy the garden. And they continued to talk friendly about that. They couldn't find a solution. They went to the abbot of the monastery. Remember my theory that when you ask a question to a wise person, you have to be prepared for self-demolition. So they went to the abbot reverentially and said, Master, I was on my meditative walk. I saw this caterpillar, very defenseless creature, frail. I put it in the cabbage garden to avoid that it could be squashed by someone. The abbot said, very well, my son. The other monk said, Master, I ponder with this brother that if we keep the caterpillar in the cabbage garden, it will eventually multiply and destroy the garden. The abbot said, very well, my son. Behind the abbot, there was a novice fanning the master, and this novice said, but master, both of them cannot be right. Very well, my son. So when you cling to an opinion, you lose a lot, you know. When you cling to an opinion, you lose a lot. Yante Hoskins was a very famous theosophist. She had a little notebook where she put down things that were very profound for her. And one of them was, belief is the tomb of truth. The moment you believe personally, and that means you shut everything out and you are content with your beliefs, It doesn't matter what the world, the state of the world is, or the people are. You are happy with your belief, it becomes a problem. Winston Churchill has said a similar thing. He said, a fanatic is a person who cannot change his or her mind and never changes the subject. So these are just examples of how the mind can become really dusty. And finally, what is self-knowledge? Is it an intellectual effort? Is it a mental effort? Fragment 2, verse 136, it says, "Shalt thou abstain from action? Not so shall gain thy soul her freedom. To reach nirvana, one must reach self-knowledge. And self-knowledge is of loving deeds the child." I'll repeat. "Shalt thou abstain from action? Not so shall gain thy soul her freedom. To reach nirvana, one must reach self-knowledge. And self-knowledge is of loving deeds the child." The implication is that we cannot progress without finding what real relationships are. Helpful relationships. And understanding other people. Not putting our ideas first, our preferences first, you know. And this is what Radhaji herself said at her human regeneration seminars in Holland in 1990, 32 years ago. She said that the first object of the TS, the Universal Brotherhood without distinction, is a mind without barriers. A mind that doesn't settle in this or that position, particularly personal positions, and that keeps itself open to experience. Thank you.
Thanks, Pedro. Fantastic. Yeah, great. Any thoughts, questions, Pedro?
Is my phone too low or yours too low?
Oh, is that better?
Yes, much better.
Okay, thank you, Pedro. Fantastic. Any questions, thoughts, comments, Pedro?
Yes, I have one question. What was that quote from Anthony Hoskins?
Belief is the tomb of truth.
Thank you.
She also said that the world is full of people who are utterly convinced that the cemeteries are full of people who were completely convinced that the world couldn't go on without them.
Yeah, Pedro, I remember the story you told about Sri Ram. And it's interesting, there was also, I think, Annie Besant. She essentially employed two murderers at Adyar, and they were never convicted, but someone asked them once, did you actually kill that person? They said, yes, we killed him. And they gave some descriptions, and they went and saw Annie Besant, and she said, well, if that's fine, but if I don't employ them, how will they change? You know? So, yeah.
Now, I have heard this in a different way. Somebody went to visit her and discovered that she was employing a former convict.
Mm.
Even today, for a convict to find a job is not easy, you know. And so this person said, is it true that you have employed a convict? And she said, yes, he has been with me for 25 years. And that speaks well for both of us.
That's it.
Well, let's see, not in the cemetery then. That's good.
Ganesha has a hand, a digital hand.
Oh, thank you. Just a comment. I think we modern people have a mirror which retains some memory. You know, nowadays I think most of the screens, they have got memories. I think our mind is a mirror with a little bit of retention. I think it keeps that's why it gives completely distorted pictures.
Yes. Yes. The mind, I was mentioning some time ago that in the book, The Key to Theosophy, Madame Blavatsky says that one ray of manas, the principle in us, one ray of manas vivifies the entire brain. So there is much more intelligence that we can attain if we know how to go about it, you know. But when as the verse says, when we become personal about things, then we learn very little.
It's interesting, the Initiate series by Cyril Scott, the Mahatma Rainier had a hobby which was changing people's points of view. But the book's got a series of stories, particularly the first one, because it's a trilogy, where the Mahatma had to engage with people at the physical level over several conversations to make a dent in their mind to be able to actually get them to take a different perspective, because mentally it was too hard for them to do it from the super physical realms. They can influence us and we'll, you know, follow our intuition or something. But these individuals and some of the stories were so set in a mindset that it took, you know, quite a bit of effort for the Mahatma to try and get them to have a different viewpoint. You know, so you're right in terms of the belief is the tomb of truth, in terms of, you know, you're not willing to accept anything else. I mean, and this is our motto, refers to that. So
yes.
To have an open mind, as Radhaji said, you know. It's interesting. Oh, sorry, as well, Pedro. Here's my little copy from Madhyar.
Very good. There is someone who has raised her hand. I don't know her name.
It's Chris. Can you?
Oh, Chris.
Me? She's to the left of Sushma.
Chris, you have to raise your voice, please.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Hello, Pedro. Thank you very much. Been very, very interesting listening to you.
Thank
you. We were just, when you were talking with Simon, then talking about the open mind, and I just wanted to contribute that very, very early in my journey, when I was hearing a lot of ideas that were totally in conflict with my religious upbringing, one of the most useful pieces of advice I was given was a speaker who said, if you're hearing anything that is in conflict with what you already know or think you know or believe, be prepared to say to yourself, what if what I know is not correct, or what if I don't already know everything? And I was certainly hearing things that were challenging me. And I just found that very, very simple way of looking at things, when whatever was put in front of me, I was willing to say, what if that's the way it is? And that way I opened my mind. And one of the first things that was troubling me at that time was when that was the first time I ever heard mention of karma. And I thought to myself, this is a pretty pat answer to everything, isn't it? You know, but I decided to just let it be. What if that's the way it was? And it was sometime down the track that one day I just realized it was no longer a challenge to me at all. So I guess what was happening was I was growing in my perception and my ability to take these new ideas on. And when I didn't fight them as something strange and let them be, then I guess my natural journey just happened. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. I think an important thing about theosophical study is that theosophy does not seek for us to have a kind of a uniform mind, a homogeneity. We have different approaches because we come from different background of experiences. So each one of us has to relate to this teaching to the best of our knowledge, and we will find some tests and some difficulties, but as our understanding grows, then our viewpoint gets enlarged, you know. Thank you for your contribution. We have another hand.
Al.
Yes, thank you, Pedro. Your talk was very enlightening, and I've been thinking about your statement that the Voice of the Silence is a mystical treatise, because it seems to me that both the mystical and the way of the occultist are both of them are necessary, and they complement each other. I've heard it said by someone a lot more versed in this than I, that they both get to the top, but the occultist takes the stairs, and the mystic takes the elevator or lift, but they both get to the top. And as they do, their perceptions are changed so that they merge in a sense, because the occultist, by studying the laws of the esoteric world, develops a love of and appreciation and an adoration of the divine, whereas the mystic, by adoring the divine, is moved ultimately to study the laws that are promulgated by the divine. And so that there's a resolution at the top, and I think we need both approaches, both the mystical and the occultist approach, to complete our journey.
Thank you.
Chris.
Yes, I was just listening to Al there, and I'm thinking, you know, those two particular paths, the mystical or the occultist, yes, you do eventually arrive at the same place. And it doesn't really matter which path you take. I guess what's happening there is nature is catering for our different personalities that are drawn to different ways of approaching the great truths, isn't it? Some paths will be more readily comfortable to some personalities, / according to the reference to the previous soul journeys. That's also coming into it, which way is going to feel more comfortable for us. And one of the things I'd like to say is it's wonderful these days when we see how widely the practice of meditation's being taken on board by many people with no particular knowledge of the occult or the mystical. But we know too that on their journey they will eventually get there also, because with meditation the great mysteries will be revealed to them. So there's just all these different paths that are make for the great variety of journeys. And what we're trying to do in the society, of course, is accommodate everybody in a way that without preconceived ideas about the way people should move forward, we try and present the knowledge so that people can choose from that which is going to be most successful for themselves in their own progress.
I'll put another twist on that.
Thank
I
you.
think, thanks, Chris. I think the mystic and occult is a simultaneous process. It's like the two sides of a coin. You can't have one without the other. As you go deeper into the mysteries, then you need to be able to understand the laws of nature, but at the same time experience unity. Because if you think about the stages in consciousness, symbolized in the various traditions, Christianity, the birth, the baptism, transfiguration, crucifixion, ascension, all of those are different states of consciousness to experience unity. And Krishnamurti talked about this in terms of his process. But at the same time, as you have those deeper levels of unity, mystic experiences, you are actually governing and learning about the laws of nature akin to those experiences as you go deeper, because the human being, at the end, the adept, the liberated human being, is both a mystic and an occultist all in one. So I feel it's a simultaneous process, going on throughout one's evolutionary path, as Pedro mentioned. It's that going within. As you go within, we learn about everything. And it's interesting. There's a little book, I'm just seeing where it is. Ernest Wood's Concentration Approach to Meditation. A great little book, and that relates to the second verse, Pedro, in the first fragment, which is, he who would hear the voice of nada, the soundless sound, and comprehend it, has to learn the nature of dharana. And the description of dharana is the intense and perfect concentration of the mind upon some one interior object, accompanied by complete abstraction from everything pertaining to the external universe or the world of the senses. Now, if you actually do those exercises, and I speak from my own experience of Ernest Wood's book, there's 36 exercises, you actually achieve that state. And it is a super physical state. It's quite an experience. So Blavatsky, right at the start, is taking you on an interior journey. It's an interior process, because if we're going to seek out the Raja of the senses, the mind, and slay it, as Pedro said, that's an internal experience. It's that meditation. It's going within. So I find that quite fascinating. Right at the very start as well, Pedro, is she's instructing us to go within, to go to the super physical parts of our nature.
Thank you.
I might add that there is that's true, that we develop both sides but they're not always, I think, simultaneous, because sometimes in this personality or that, there's a greater tendency towards mysticism or to occultism, and therefore the approach tends to be more one or the other, but ultimately they do resolve. And I think it gets back to a concept that Annie Besant elucidated in her book Esoteric Christianity, where she said that every religion, or you can say every belief system, has to reach all of its adherents wherever they are in their evolution. Because if you have, for example, religion that is, as some have said of Christianity, as simple as the simplest mind of man, well, then it offers nothing to the philosopher or the deep thinker. Whereas, and if you have something that has nothing but very abstruse concepts, you will totally shut out the peasant or the farmer or someone who doesn't think that deeply. And therefore, a belief system like Theosophy, an understanding like Theosophy, has to meet each of us, each of its adherents, where they are on the path and take them further. And if it does that, then it is successful.
Thank you.
Here is the book.
Oh, yes.
And there's actually
Did Sushma design the cover?
Actually, I designed the more recent edition.
Oh, very good. Now, Esther has a new participant there. What is his name?
This is Rinpo Smooch, named after the Dalai Lama's cat, Rinpoche.
Really?
He's a rescue cat, 12 years old now.
Very
Got
good.
him 2 years ago.
Very good.
Thank you for welcoming Rinpo Smooch.
Very good. C.W. Leadbeater was saying in a letter where he was saying there was a cat in the house and there was classical music playing, and he was observing the mind of the cat clairvoyantly, and he said that the cat was trying to chase up every note in that classical piece, but because the piece was so fast, there was a time that he just gave up and he went elsewhere. But for some reason, he found it amusing in the beginning to try and chase the notes of. Now, there is another cat in the snow in Switzerland. Who is that lady with the cat in the snow?
Vera. There's Vera from HPB Lodge in Auckland.
What is his or her name?
Oh, you're on mute, Vera.
The cat disappeared. Is it a virtual cat?
Oh, it's a real cat. It's Lada.
Lada.
Yes.
And what does that name mean?
The Lada is a Slavic goddess, but of course, Russian called it the Ka, Lada.
Very good. So she must have a throne in your house.
Of course. She is the boss, yes.
I once had to prepare a presentation about animal qualities, and I discovered that this quote that in the ancient world, cats were considered deities, and they haven't forgotten it.
Of course not. Yep,
That'd be right.
that'll be right. Yep.
That's quite good, Pedro. Very good.
Yeah.
All right, I've had instructions from Madam Weber, and I quote her, "Close the meeting, Simon." Unquote. I want to thank you, Pedro. Fantastic. Really, really good. Inspiring us. And I won't say too much because, you know, you can, nothing needs to be said. Oh, hang on, we've got something in the chat here. Let's have a look. Oh, that's from Bill. Thanks, Pedro. Yep, great. Okay, so we'll just have a bit of silence in closing.